One thing I would like to say is I am just supremely impressed with people who engage in empirical research on anomalous phenomena, on remote viewing. Research in and of itself is a lot of work. Thankless hours of sometimes going uphill with no real results. So let's give a hearty round of applause to everyone here who is involved in this noble endeavor of research in remote viewing. Very good. What I would like to do initially, if I might, is just read briefly to you a summary of the study, and then we'll talk about it and get into it from a more pragmatic standpoint. Now, in this study, the examiner assumed the behavioral identity of the target examinee, Slobodan Milosevic, through a procedure described as referential framing. Now, preparation for referential framing is not unlike other procedures used by remote viewers in their efforts to observe specified target coordinates. Now, initially, the examiner assimilates publicly available behavioral data on the target examinee to establish a characterological response set. The objectives of referential framing are achieved by the examiner or a cohort using progressive relaxation and related techniques that we've talked a lot about here this weekend for the self-induction of what could be described as tertiary dissociation. And for some, tertiary dissociation is critical for going, in quotes, enroll as the target examinee. Acclimation of the target examinee role guides the pattern of personality test item endorsement by the examiner or cohort. Now, phenomenological profiling, and we can thank Carl Stump back in 1883 for phenomenological theory. What we do is attempt to retrofit the target examinee's primary personality traits as most likely expressed by their endorsement of true, false, yes, no, very linear, forced choice items to common garden variety personality tests. Now, in short, the paper-pencil personality tests measure the examiner or cohort's projection of the target examinee's overt and covert behavioral dispositions. These dispositions are operationalized by uniform test scoring and interpretation procedures following conventional group norm comparative standards. Now, the interpreted results are documented in a detailed hard copy report. In the current pilot project, folks, we used two widely studied industry standard objective personality tests that many of you, I'm sure, have heard of, familiar with the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory 2nd edition. And from Great Britain, the Eysenck Personality Questionnaire Revised, EPQR. Now, previous factor analytic studies have repeatedly shown that both of these tests are reliable measures, at least of an individual's contact or surface personality, in particular, personality traits, the more enduring, long-standing characteristics of our behavioral tendencies. Once we got the test profile completed, we forwarded the report to an expert, thereby establishing a monitor for the efficacy that needs to be maintained in a predictive validity study. Thereafter, what we did is have a series of judges, 32 judges, and these were upper-level undergraduate and graduate psychology students. So they know a little bit about tests and measurements and behavioral profiling. To evaluate the test report describing Milosevic's personality with the predictions about things that might happen later on, using as a comparative standard or a standard of concordance, at least 24 different news accounts that had appeared in the newspaper, in the media, after the report of Milosevic's profile had been completed and forwarded to the monitor. Chi-square analysis was used to evaluate the predictive validity of Milosevic's remotely determined personality profile according to this inter-judge reliability rating procedure. And this procedure followed Cattell's rank order of merit model. Now, the results showed that the judges, and there were 32 of these judges, who were not coached and who were given the report without signatures being on the report, so they had no idea who the author was. The judges' personality ratings indicate that the behavioral response tendencies were significantly supported by the concurrent material, the news reports, which of course were published after Milosevic's report had been completed, and this covers a period from June 1999 through April 2001. The report was completed June of 99. It was sent out on June the 21st, 1999. Now, variations in methodology, including field applications and recommendations for future research, can be discussed. So with the audience's permission, I'm going to shift to the right, if that's okay. Okay, I want to be able to put some things up on the screen, and I do have some handouts that I'll be giving you a little bit later on. Slobodan Milosevic, a very, very interesting character, unique in many respects, in that much of what was discerned in the remote sensing of his personality was of a dualistic nature, both a very strong masculine and feminine presence. And initially, when the profile was being reconstructed, something occurred that I had never done. And I've been using the MMPI almost every day of the working week, either clinically or in research or teaching, since 1976, is I put his coordinates on a female profile psychograph. And then I realized that a little bit later on. Essentially, when you remotely sense Slobodan, you can't help but tap into his extremely, if not symbiotic, dependent relationship on his wife, Mira Markovic. And the two are fused in many respects. I'm giving you just some samples of the comparative standard by which the report was evaluated. All of these articles, of course, appeared after the report had been completed, some as recently as April of this year. So we start to get snatches of the media accounts of his behavioral profile, very general in many respects, although some specific behaviors that were documented and reported through the media later on that were likewise predicted by the report, that's where things get really interesting. If you can just bear with me, this will give you a kind of orientation to the material that's on the report when we talk about it. And we'll be looking at those, that profile right away. In particular, this is one of the latter pieces that were used. Hours after brandishing a pistol, ranting about suicide, and finally surrendering to police. That's very interesting. And those of you who have followed what's been happening in the Balkans likewise probably see Montenegro being mentioned as an instability hotspot for the time being. We know that the War Crimes Tribunal will eventually verify other things that now are only being conjectured. Very interesting individual, Mira Milosevic. She is a very powerful influence and has been, apparently, for a long time in Slobodan's life. Now, the profile itself, this is an MMPI-2 profile, and very briefly, without boring you and getting real academic here, we need to just mention something about the scales. What does the test measure? Well, first of all, Yovian, McKinley, and Stark Hathaway back in the late 30s, early 40s developed this test using the Maudsley Personality Inventory, which later on became the Eysenck Personality Questionnaire, which is the other technique used in this particular approach. They wanted a reliable psychiatric diagnostic objective inventory. Okay, so it was standardized on about 2,260 rural Minnesota psychiatric inpatients going back to the 40s. Well, the entire diagnostic nomenclature has changed. I mean, we're in a totally different world now, but we still use the same concept and the same categories. The MMPI has been very widely studied. It's the most widely studied objective paper-pencil personality test on the planet. There's 567 items. Now, the interesting thing is it's been studied so much that we can start to extract information that takes us way out of the clinical arena. And one of the unfortunate things that has happened in personality profiling has been this fusion, if you will, between psychiatric diagnosis and personality profiling. Well, these are two distinctly different enterprises. With the MMPI, even a subclinical profile, this is a normal profile on the surface, you get very interesting bits of information on whoever takes it if you know the trait clusters, the principal traits that are measured by each of these scales. Okay? So let's forget about psychiatric diagnosis in the clinical world for the time being, and let's just look at this as being like a roadmap that gives us a little information about a person's character structure. The first three scales are the validity scales. Lie scale, the higher you are here, obviously the more fibs you've told on the test, because the items are reworded in such a way that the same question is asked repeatedly, but if there's inconsistency in responsiveness to that item, then obviously we're not being honest. The F scale is the infrequency scale. It's normally elevated when individuals endorse a wide range of divergent kinds of traits and behaviors, and also clinical signs and symptoms that no human being could have all of. It typically is elevated with people that have difficulty reading, okay? The K scale is the subtle defensiveness scale. When people approach this test from a guarded, defensive frame of reference because, oh, I don't want anybody looking at my personality, I don't want to be under the microscope, well, then we'll have an elevation there. The first scale, HS, is hypochondriasis, and it's typically elevated in individuals who have a wide range of somatic concerns and physical complaints. To a lesser extent, it's slightly elevated in people who tend to complain more than other people. And we all know people who tend to, you know, it may not be to a pathological degree, complain. And they're the first to let you know about it. And they're usually the ones that are in line at the customer service desks in the supermarkets and so forth. D scale depression speaks for itself. It's more of a state scale than a trait scale. That is to say, emotional state. If you are experiencing a breakup with your partner, or the IRS is breathing down your neck, or you've had a lot of other negative stuff happen to you in a short period of time, you may have no history of depression yourself, but if you take the test at the time these events are occurring, you'll be elevated on scale 2. HY, hysteria. Here's where we get into the dynamics of impulsivity, of a need to attract attention to oneself, the tendency to be able to dissociate easy on scale 3, PD, psychopathic deviant. These are individuals who reject authority and who typically engage in norm-violating behavior, who have difficulty profiting from past experience, and who tend to seek thrills in order to stimulate themselves. Masculinity, femininity, scale 5. This particular scale, when it's elevated in males, it shows interest in activities that have traditionally been described as feminine activities. It also indicates maternal dependence. Scale 6, paranoia, suspicious thinking, tendencies towards grandiosity or persecutory thinking. Scale 7, psychasthenia. Here we get into the business of obsessional thinking in people who are worry warts and who have a lot of excessive anxiety. But those folks tend to be very punctual, very ordered, and are really good psychotherapy clients because they'll stay with you and they're in just enough distress to be motivated for a positive outcome. SC, schizophrenia, not so much tapping into schizophrenia here as my experience is it taps into divergent thinkers. A lot of people who are in the creative arts sometimes are high on this scale. It does indicate a loosening of boundaries, and when it's extremely high, you can also see social withdrawal. MA is mania, bipolar disorder in current nomenclature terms. People have a whole lot of energy, and they are moving a lot. And SI is social introversion. The higher you are, the more socially withdrawn an individual tends to be. With this particular profile, it's not clinically significant. You have to hit 70 T and above in order to be in the clinically significant range. He's not there. However, let's take a look at why he's not there. The reason that Slobo's not there is essentially because his profile is largely invalid. Why is it invalid? Because a little formula subtracting the infrequency scale T-score or the K scale T-score from the infrequency scale T-score gives us a negative 19. Research has shown that if you are negative 11, 12, and above, and certainly beyond a negative 15 from the F minus K equation, that what you've attempted to present an overly favorable profile of yourself on the test, okay? Which means highly questionable everything that's on the clinical scales, the 10 clinical scales. Does that mean we throw that away? No, because sometimes we only get one shot at somebody. And the fact that an individual, an adult, would try to present such a grossly, naively overly favorable profile is, shall we say, diagnostic in and of itself. So with that information, what we can do, conceptually anyway, is look at the peaks and the valleys on the scale scores and just move those peaks up a few notches, and then you start to get a flavor for what the individual is guarding against. And this is what we're seeing with Milosevic. Now, the other test that was used is much briefer, 100 items, Ising Personality Questionnaire. Again, it served as the original model for the MMPI, so these two tests are reliable. That is, they both measure introversion and they show a high correlation on that particular scale. They both measure anxiety, excess anxiety, show a high correlation. External locus of control, internal locus of control, you name it. And here we see we're looking at a P12, E11, N9, and L12 code. And this will be flashed up on here as well. In order for us to look at how we make an interpretation of those scores, we take a look in the upper right-hand corner at the norms, the means and standard deviations of the P scale, which stands for psychoticism, but really means tough-mindedness. The E scale is extroversion. The higher you are, the more extroverted you are. The lower you are, you tend towards social introversion. N scale is neuroticism, an older term used to describe emotional stability if you're high, or emotional stability if you're low, emotional instability if you're high, and the Lie scale for dissimulation, which means not only if you're elevated here could the test be invalid because the person was fibbing on the items, but also it taps into the trait of a tendency to, well, distort things a little bit, to exaggerate, and to maybe tell a few more white lies than what your neighbors do. So we're looking at Slobodan in relation to that particular approach. Now, we never use personality tests in isolation. We use them in combination. You look for convergence. If one reliable test shows that the individual tends towards social introversion and the other test does not support that, we really don't have a finding, okay? So you're looking at convergence, and the linear approach to this data is we collect the data, you develop your inferences, you reject your inferences or modify them on the basis of being able to observe the subject after the data has been gathered, or you accept your inferences. Then you develop and integrate your hypotheses. You construct a dynamic model of the person. You have to add to that dynamic model situational variables, because our emotional states sometimes will cover our usual behavioral response tendencies, because we tend to behave a little bit more extremely in many respects in response to stressors. And then prediction of behavior. That's essentially the model that was followed after the profile had been constructed. Now, what's fascinating here is, if I could go back to the MMPI, and we do have this business about him being referred by, who is referred by Bill Clinton. Well, that's not altogether false. And if you look at the date of that, June the 18th, nonetheless, come to think of it, I kind of miss old, never mind. But anyway, well, I know, it depends on what we're into. Let's take a look at the report itself. Now, believe me, I'm not going to bore you with all this garbage and psychobabble, but this is the report essentially in the same format that the Monitor received it. And we're talking about the validity triad, and we're talking about the fact that the test shows a tendency towards an overly favorable profile, and we go down and we interpret each scale. We interpret it according to a code. We look at the 2- and 3-point code clusters. The elevations on these scales give us different combinations of codes by which to interpret the results. Now let's look at some of the primary traits suggested by this particular test, and it doesn't look really all that negative. Over-conventional and conforming, moralistic, rigidly virtuous, defensive, response sad. Conventional, sincere, socially conforming, possibly faking good. Here at K of a 63, adaptive, self-reliant, unwilling to seek help, moderate defensiveness, no acknowledgement of distress, little or no special concern about bodily health. Let's keep moving. Inhibited, irritable, timid, moody, discouraged, blue, unhappy, dissatisfied with self, etc., etc. Self-centered and superficial, immature, manipulative, impulsive and adventurous, self-controlled, expressive and demonstrative, balanced and cheerful, wary, evasive, stubborn, responsible and conscientious. Hey, you know, a lot of these traits, I would like to, this guy would be a good neighbor, right? I mean, so where's the beef? Well, in reality, folks, when we sometimes in the flesh test individuals who are in leadership positions and who possibly may be engaged in white-collar crime, but nonetheless have a distinguished record of education, other kinds of achievements, you very often get a kind of normal, boring profile. The more sophisticated the individual, the more they are able to use their defenses and fake good on the test. But thank God for the validity scales, because that's what pins the tail on the donkey. Now, moving forward a little bit, we can go into, I have copies of some of these reports floating around. If any of you would dare to tread into these waters, you're certainly welcome to have one. We're not really seeing a whole lot here, other than this individual tends to be very tightly controlled emotionally. And to make a long story short, the way this individual acts out their own unacceptable impulses is by forming a strong relationship with an individual who tends to act out anyway, with an individual who is impulsive, because this is a pathological balance in that the tightly controlled individual can vicariously discharge their own impulses through this acting out individual. And this is a classic case with Mira and Slobo. Just, it's worthy of a movie, believe me. And there is considerable evidence post hoc to suggest that in terms of his policymaking, or the lack thereof, that she played a very influential role, and sometimes quite impulsively, in terms of some of the governing strategies that came out of that particular regime. Where it starts to get interesting is, and this is where in the actual enroll process. Now let me tell you folks, I come to remote sensing, I'm not saying remote viewing, a little differently I think from a lot of other people. Everything that I know about remote sensing, I was fortunate enough to be able to pick the brain of a very talented individual by the name of Cleve Baxter, and that's where I get my orientation. The bottom line is, when this was being done, there was a period in which I think I dissociated to the point that there's a little time distortion and perhaps a little psychogenic amnesia. It was, to me, really exhausting doing this, but it's almost like I was no longer in control, and something else was, the Spirit was moving me. Jesus is watching us. Yes, this is true. So where this report really shifts, and this is what I got to read to you, is in the 7227.2-point code. So scales 7 and 2 are the final two code pair falling above t-score 55 and may have a remarkable impact on the constellation of behavioral traits previously reported. While this examinee typically suppresses strong emotional impulses, scale 3, or acts them out vicariously through the overt emotionality of significant others, scale 4, he has the potential to experience bouts of agitation, tension, and under prolonged stress, what can be described as an irritable depression. These episodes are usually short-lived. Still, these behavior dynamics can be abruptly manifested when this examinee's emotional suppression and vicarious acting out are repeatedly disrupted and no longer work for him. Now, the implication of the 2772 code in relation to a slightly more prominent 3443 code suggests that under conditions of prolonged and seemingly intractable stress, like we gotcha, that the traits 4 and 3 normally manipulate away, the dormant, agitated, depressive features of 7.2 may burst out in impulsive, self-destructive behavior. The anger that is typically denied becomes fleetingly conscious, and thus internally that is self-directed. This underlies the appearance of agitated depression and possible self-destructive components. Now, the primary 3443 code insulates this guy pretty well, but long-standing present stressors would eventually lead to chronic frustration, thereby generating sustained discomfort. These are the bangs, okay? This doesn't fit with the rest of the profile. And the interesting thing is and I know that we have some psychologists here and people trained in testing, you never, any self-respecting psychologist would never make a prediction this hard and fast about autolethality on the basis of objective paper pencil test results. You don't do that. You look at observational data. You do the interview. You get the reports from family members. You might pull it all together in conjunction with some testing. So it was after I sent this to the expert monitor, I felt like, gosh, I just really went on a limb. But intuitively, I felt that was so right on at the time. And to my knowledge, consciously, there was no other information floating around out there to indicate that Milosevic could be an impulsive, although subintended, suicidal risk. Basically, the guy is a hard worker, hard-nosed, and to the very, very end, as we now all know, and as the report states over and over again, he is persistent. He's consistent. And what we saw, when you look at that along with some other traits, in particular the elevated scale P, which is clinically significant, and it doesn't mean he's psychotic. He's far from psychotic. There's not, he's the other end of. Mira, on the other hand, is close to that, a little south of the border, but she's close. The guy is tough-minded, which means that he will accomplish his agenda or attempt to accomplish his agenda at all cost. And it doesn't matter how many people die in the streets, and it doesn't matter how much your countrymen suffer, or you completely destroy or lead to the destruction of the infrastructure of your country. He is persistent in his agenda, and he will accomplish it no matter what. The other characteristic of high P, which is tough-mindedness, is an inability to experience empathy, genuine empathy. Most of us in here have, we've got an interpersonal reflex that allows us, as we grow up, to observe and model other people and feel what other people are feeling in certain social situations. That's much of what our communication is much more covert than it is overt. This guy doesn't have it. That's why he can remain in power when obviously he's letting his country be destroyed. That is significant. The other thing about P, and it goes on and on and on, let's say people scoring moderately high on P scale tend to be driven, hardworking, assertive, goal-directed, notably strong-willed. Success-oriented high achievers frequently display this trait to a moderate degree. It serves you well in a competitive capitalistic society. Moderate P. If you're going to go up the corporate ladder, what there is left of it. However, and it can also be the stuff of leadership, and is probably common to politicians and other individuals who seek highly competitive situations. On the other hand, elevated P can be the basis for impermeable belief systems, blind obedience, and pushing through one's agenda. The assertive diligence expressed by this trait sometimes goes beyond healthy aggressiveness to the level of abrasiveness. In its more extreme phenotypic expression, high P is the stuff of a full-blown delusional system. And this is why Hans Eysenck called it the cluster of scales that measure this particular trait psychoticism, because if you've ever worked with individuals who have a true delusional system, no matter how well integrated the rest of their personality might be, whenever you tap into content that's related to the delusion, they get crazy. And there's nothing you can do to penetrate, change, alter the delusional system. It's resistant. It's so tough. Its boundaries will not allow for any kind of modification. So in keeping aware of the time here, basically, though, when you look at this particular profile in relation to the history of the test, there are some quadrants there are some characteristics that do emerge when you approach this test from a very ancient temperament profiling system of the Galen-Wundt scheme of the four temperaments. He's a phlegmatic, which means that typically, when his world isn't crumbling or when Mira isn't giving him a hard time, he's passive, careful, thoughtful, peaceful, controlled, reliable, even-tempered, calm. If you think about all the photographs, illustrations, footage that you saw of Milosevic right up until the NATO aerial campaign, his facial expression's kind of stoic, not change. It doesn't change very much, right? It's pretty solid, right-on kind of guy. That's the dynamic between him and Mira. Mira can act out and blow off and send the guards out in the rain and order firing on the demonstrators in the 1996 election. And Slobodan is very calm. He's an anchor for her. She expresses feelings and emotions that he never learned how to express. Everything comes to a conclusion. So what happened now? Let me just say that the judges who read the reports relative to the news media accounts in order to see how the subsequent news media accounts supported the predictions and the report. The judges were not given pages 12 and 13, the last two pages, because essentially here we go so far off the page that it is just not in the interest of soon-to-be psychologists to see that kind of flying by the seat of your pants. But nonetheless, there's a lot of stuff here. And where I think we can pull it together, there are elements here suggesting that Milosevic and Markovic share a symbiotic attachment that may board on a Follet-Adois type dynamic. This psychological symbiosis centers on the complementary or pathological balance that arises on the surface level, but is rooted in Milosevic's and Markovic's respective intra, that is within, personal conflicts. For example, Slobo is emotionally over-controlled while Markovic is emotionally labile. On the surface, Milosevic seems reserved, poised, and somewhat stoic, while Markovic in many respects is the opposite, overly dramatic, overbearing, and loud. Milosevic keeps his feelings tightly wrapped, while Markovic is overly expressive and does the feeling for both of them. Milosevic denies and suppresses anger and strong emotions, while Markovic is emotionally impulsive, temperamental, acts out the mood of the moment, and when challenged can be explosive, combative, and out of control. Milosevic shows internal locus of control, which complements Markovic's external locus of control. And the dynamic here is one of a pathological balance, but it was adaptive for them up until a few years ago. Milosevic characteristically discharges his suppressed anger through Markovic and her outbursts. Should this pathological balance be disrupted for an extended period so that Slobo's not able to vicariously act out his suppressed emotions, he would likely show a rather abrupt emotional decompensation. Let me just say that if Markovic, for whatever reason, was temporarily out of the picture, notice what isn't mentioned here is, should Slobodan be arrested? And let me tell you, he's not taken to a co-educational cell. All right, there's no swimming pool, no Club Med for the Gray Hotel in Belgrade. But that was the bottom line, is Milosevic would probably show agitated depression if he could not maintain this symbiotic relationship. Now, occasionally Markovic travels a little bit without him, but for the most part, they are together. They are hooked together. It is quite possible, should they be separated against their will, that this agitated depression of Slobo's might be accompanied by impulsive, although subintended, self-destructive gestures. In this sense, Milosevic is not a general risk for autolethal acting out, but he still shows a distinct liability towards suicide if his wife's histrionics were in some way muzzled, thereby depriving him of the only emotional release or outlet that is immediately available to him, which is essentially what went down when he was being arrested. And man, I'd love to have a video tape of that. I'm sorry for my vicarious voyeuristic tendencies, but that's one of my traits, and I suspect it might be something that we see in other people who engage in remote sensing for some reason. What do we really have here? Well, all of us know, I'm wrapping up, all of us know of the P.T. Barnum or Aunt Fanny effect, that if you write long, this is a 13-page report, if you write long enough and general enough in your behavioral descriptors, you can fit everybody in this room. Oh, that's me? Yeah, right. Okay. So we have to take that in consideration. We also have to take into consideration the inter-rater reliability approach to evaluating the predictive validity of the report. Here we have upper-level undergraduate psych students and graduate psych students. I'm teaching them, and this was a lab component of of 2 different tests and measurements courses. Now, while they didn't know who did the report and they were given very objective, straightforward instructions, nonetheless, the experimenter or examiner expectancy effect is such that when you have people in a somewhat submissive position, and let me tell you, I don't know anything any more submissive than being a student. If you're a graduate, no matter how old you are, you have to, and you're finishing your graduate degree, we know what that's about. So perhaps there was that kind of influence where it skewed their ratings, which tended to be really high. And so that's something that we have to look at. And the other question that's asked is, okay, if you can remotely sense an individual's behavioral dynamics, then why put them on a psychological test? Why do that? What's the point of that? Well, that's where we get into the linear transformation that wasn't in the experience that the examiner had in entering Milosevic's phenomenal field. You get a certain predictive efficiency with test profiles that have good reliability data behind them that you may not get flying by the seat of your pants by extracting those predictions on the basis of your remote observations. The other piece is that there's other ways this can be done. The examiner, somebody familiar with the test, can recruit psychics or individuals who have been trained in remote viewing to essentially assume the role by engaging and entering the phenomenal field of a target individual. And then that remote viewer in that state of tertiary dissociation, taking the tests, and who I find to be the most sensitive individuals for using the cohort are actors. Are people who are experienced and who live by going in role. They're particularly sensitive to, if you can give them some orienting material, a little bit of data on the subject. Now take that role and be it the Strasberg method or improvisational style that they've been trained in, let them go with it, and then let them approach, as if they were that individual, a battery of psychological tests, and then let's see what happens. Well, we could go on and on with this, but that's the fun and the downside of these things. So I'm ready for Q&A.
Well, I think you've done a remarkable analysis based on the study impressions.
Thank you.
But I am confused about the initial premise where the MMPI, as you said, has been normed on several thousand Minnesota farmers in the 1940s.
Right.
And you're applying that to a Yugoslav dictator in the 1990s. Wouldn't the behavior of the farmers in the 40s hugely differ with regard to the norms for this guy in a different culture at a later time?
Absolutely, Russell. And let me just tell you, this is the MMPI-2, which was renormed with about 1,000 more people, but all U.S. citizens, geographically largely concentrated on the West Coast. And this is the downside of test reliability and validity studies. However, the MMPI has been used so extensively that lots of generalizations are made in reference to other reliability studies using other unique individuals. While a lot of this data is not reported in the standardization manual, you always get into the cultural bias business of, okay, if this were in another language, would there be a direct translation from English to Slavic or what have you? That's the fun thing about this approach, is that we are assuming that Slobo is responding to those items as they would be asked him in his language, okay?
It's not a language issue that I assume that Slobo and his wife go to the ballet every night, but the only people who go to the ballet among the Minnesota farmers are probably gay men in the 1940s. So I would think that if you ask the 1940 farmer, what do you think about the ballet, you're going to pull out a very unique cohort compared to a Yugoslav intellectual.
Well, again, I think your point is well taken. I think people who do testing tell you that these are the weaknesses. Nonetheless, then it would pretty much invalidate the use of the MMPI-2 today on anyone, would it not? Because I don't think there's anyone in this room that would be like rural 1938, 39, 1940 Minnesota farmers who happen to find themselves, some of them, the clinical sample anyway, institutionalized or hospitalized. The world has changed tremendously. And when you're standardizing a test, you do geographical sampling, where you have representation all over the United States. The people in Las Vegas are different than the people in Jonesville, Virginia. So my point is, but the issue that you raise is relevant to, it's the use of this test in contemporary terms on anyone, okay? Because the normative standard of comparison largely is that initial MMPI-1 group back in Minnesota. Good point. Thank you.
I was wondering, when you were testing this, did you run into the concept of conscience? Because that's what I'm learning. Do these people have a conscience?
With Slobo, again, the high P, the high tough-mindedness, significantly high tough-mindedness scale score on the EPQR suggested that he knows how to act like he's has a conscience. He knows that he has high social intelligence. He observes, so he knows the appropriate ways to act to show empathy, sympathy. But he does not feel that. He does not feel that.
I worked with a psychologist in Bosnia and Croatia and created an exhibition of the children of war. And I also have worked with World Relief with Kosovo refugees.
Great.
So I'm coming from phenomenology in a slightly different way and not behavior. I mean, a worker or a person having to deal with this is coming from a phenomenological stance with this person and having to make a lot of judgments, and not judgments, but perceptions, and organize their own experience in relationship to this in order not to become totally traumatized themselves. Right. And in the beginning, when the programs first started happening, the people in Norway that did a lot of this really extensive works, and I'm in touch with them, they're friends of mine, and I know their programs well, it was very clear to the people involved what was going on and who was doing what, but it was not clear to the rest of the world for a very long time. Okay, and so I personally, you know, maybe it's not so much a question and you can't respond, but I'm not so much interested in the MMPI as a behavioral construction other than an academic exercise in terms of the phenomenological experience of thousands and thousands of people who read and have to live this and are still living it and have to come to terms in a very realistic way with what they think and what they feel about this kind of person. Okay? So it's more
extremely well. Very good. Thank you.
Let me just clarify one thing.
Sure.
Do I understand that you were the person who produced the profile?
That is correct.
That took the MMPI? Well, let me just have us acknowledge a couple of things. As a psychologist, you know, I was trained on the MMPI 25 years ago, but
so was I.
I remember the items well that load on various scales.
Okay,
so.
let me just.
But could I finish, please?
I did not go to an item by item endorsement.
Okay.
I went directly to the scales.
Okay.
Okay, went directly to the scale. So I didn't do an item by item endorsement.
So you did not take the 567
I did not take
items.
the 567
Okay.
items.
Second observation, the design that you're using is basically one that all of us as remote viewers would call total front loading, in that you completely knew the task and were familiar with information on the target. And so I would suggest this is more relaxed role playing than it is remote viewing.
That can be appreciated. And from that standpoint, I look at the utility of using cohorts who have been trained according to whatever. Either way, thank you very much. If you have any other questions, I'll be around. I'll be glad to talk to you individually.